welcome to Push Your Glasses Up. I'm Mikey, and today we're going to be talking about Fraggle Rock Return to the Rock, or Back to the Rock. For some reason, I screw that up every single time I actually talk about the show. Maybe it's just something to do with The Rock, the person. But I am joined by somebody who is possibly the most fitting person to have on for this episode. Welcome to Anne Kirn. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Excited to be here.
Do you want to tell people why you might be the most fitting person to have on this episode?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of competition for like huge Muppet fans, I would say, out there, which is great that there are so many people that it was a huge part of their lives. I would say maybe the fact that I am a puppet builder and now sort of a puppeteer. I have done one professional commissioned video, which was all self-taught, but I have done some puppeteering now, so I can also describe myself as a puppeteer. And there are in fact puppets just to one side of me, but if I had laid them behind me somewhere, they would have looked dead, and it would have been very
yeah. There's a rule about that. So
yeah.
Well, it is. I'm very excited to have you on for that purpose. My connection is probably just as lifelong as yours. I was just down in Florida for a trip to the Disney parks, and I had never actually done Muppet Vision before,
Wow.
because I feel like I can't get the right people to be with me when I do. So I got to do that, and I at least force my way into that section of the park to make sure I at least get in there. Unfortunately, the store, I was gonna buy a Muppet Babies Kermit for my newest nephew, and that store was closed still. So I was bummed out, and they were already like phasing out some of the Muppet stuff from in there. But yeah, I going back to basically, like, I was born a year after the original Fraggle Rock started, and so it was kind of just always there when I was a little kid, and then going into like the animated series and stuff as well, to the point where I went into my closet and have because also in the 80s every meal was a Happy Meal. I also have all of these.
Oh yeah, I've got those too.
The problem is I didn't realize I have a lot of gobos.
Oh wow, that is a lot of gobos.
Apparently, when Fraggle Rock, these are from 1988 as well. There was no show on at this time. I don't know what was going on at McDonald's, but yeah. So I apparently, when they had this partnership, I was forcing my parents to bring me to McDonald's every day. Because usually there's a rotation. But yeah, that is our histories with this show a little bit. So let's get on into this new version of Fraggle Rock. What did you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a like weirdly emotionally loaded show to come into. Like, I think that's been an experience that a lot of people our age have been having regularly, because there have been so many reboots and sequels and things from your childhood coming back. And I think especially like Fraggle Rock, because for a lot of people they saw it when they were very young, so it wasn't like a Star Wars maybe you saw when you were a little bit older, but it's like a core memory kind of thing, I think, for a lot of people. And I think being excited about that on the one hand, but also being kind of concerned, especially because it's like, well, how are you going to approach this as an adult, and how can you sort of set the adult side of yourself aside for a second and try to appreciate what it would be like for a kid to watch now. And I would actually love to hear from some friends at some point who have young children and see like what were their reactions to it, what did the kids think. But I really enjoyed it. I mean, I think it took me a little while to warm up, and not that I disliked it, but I didn't quite click with it as much as I wanted to, I think. Um, but I feel like by the end of it that I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's me, maybe it's that they kind of were figuring out what they were doing too, because I'm sure, for the people working on the show had very much the same relationship with it. There were only two people really coming back from the original show, which must have been a very interesting experience for them as well, I imagine. to revisit it after that long. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very much in the spirit of what Jim Henson was trying to do with Fraggle Rock in the first place, right? Of that kind of trying to bridge gaps, I guess, like trying to bring people together. I mean, I don't know. He was hoping to end the Cold War, as I
Yeah.
recall. Was kind of it was a lofty goal for a show about little creatures that eat radishes. But I think that it has that kind of potential really to address some really big issues and especially emotional issues for kids. And I think they did a good job of finding ways to do that, but in updated ways, like about what are things that worry kids the most now, right?
Yeah. And it's what's really interesting about this is it's I never really thought of Fraggle Rock as like an educational show just because it wasn't doing the Sesame Street side of it where it's like these are the letters, these are the because it is for like a slightly older age group.
Yeah.
Like it's obviously fine for like toddlers to watch, but like it's not necessarily for that sort of age group as far as like what they need to be learning at that point. But like I going into this one was sort of it's been so long since I've watched the original, and it's more of like the imagery and feeling connection that I have for it. So like there's an episode about consent. There's an episode about like echo chambers. Like it is covering things that are like extremely adult topical things, but in a way that is super accessible, and it just manages to cover it in a way that like brings a little bit of an opening for parents to then like continue the conversation, which is really really interesting. And like I don't remember the original show necessarily doing that as intently as this one does. Like it almost felt like it was hidden a little more in the like Jim Henson's love of like fantasy stuff, because like it's not Dark Crystal fantasy, but like it's still a little more than like what you get with the Muppets and whatnot. But so yeah, it is a very very cool thing to go back to this. And I like, this is gonna sound a little bit bizarre, but like it is meant as a compliment to them. It felt like I was sitting on the floor in the waiting room of my dentist's office when I was a little kid, because they had a CRT TV and a VHS player. And so it was like a wash of that feeling by like episode 2. Episode 1 is just like sort of, it's just set up there. It doesn't really have as much of the like the lesson stuff. It's just sort of like, this is who the Fraggles are. Have at it. And then like by the second episode, it does pick up on a little bit more of those sort of lessons and things that are actually being taught in this show. And it's just very, very cool to see how well that was handled, because that is a very tough thing to balance, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, the original show had, I mean, obviously it was sort of about these ideas of conflict, but there was also a lot of environmentalism as a concept in the show. And as much as we talked about that in the 1980s, obviously a much more important and conversation to have now, and also a much bigger part of children's lives. Like it's something that they're significantly more aware of, to the point that I don't think you can say you're not going to teach your kids about it, because they're going to find out. Like these are concepts that are so omnipresent for all of us, that it's a difficult thing to talk about, but a really important one. And I thought that they handled that very well, of like, what are the big differences between then and now. And I think, it's more self-aware, I guess I would say, which I think is, but without being, it's not like meta. I think that they avoided kind of falling into that, which could potentially have been harmful, I think, to kind of speaking to children. But, kids are very aware of themselves too. I think like the episode about Wembley kind of accidentally becoming a celebrity and kind of falling into this trap of capitalism.
I love that. I just caught up on the tail end of the season today, and that is one of my favorite episodes. I love Kenan Thompson in that episode. And just the fact that they made that character basically Guy Fieri for some reason. That was the design choice. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's something that it's not that it wasn't a concept that might have existed in the 80s, but now, I mean, I think kids are starting on YouTube so young and they're so used to the idea of like and subscribe and people being sort of celebrities and the idea that anybody could be that person.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out how to handle that emotionally and then how it fits into, are these other characters manipulating him? And what are their goals by doing that? And is it really just about kind of their success? And using him as a tool. I mean, those are really complicated ideas, but they're absolutely something that kids now would be exposed to on some level. And like, I think it was a good choice. And when you're sort of sitting down, I mean, I assume there was some conversation about, obviously these characters have to be real and they have to have lives, but what can we talk about? Like, how can we use their lives to talk about these things and what things do we want to talk about? And I felt like they made a lot of good choices about what they picked. For what hopefully is a first season. I'm hoping they're going to do more. I'm not sure if they've gotten an official pickup or not.
It's also a little strange that like they did the episode dump the way they did, because Apple TV is for the, I would assume, judging by a couple other shows, is a weekly normally kind of show. I guess because it's a kids thing and they're like, kids are just going to want to watch everything over and over and over and over. So that makes sense. But like, it was still a little surprising, at least to see them go with that route. But another thing that like I found interesting that like, I'm sure it was there in the original, but like, again, been so long. The way that they explored the relationship with Junior and his father, not as much with his mother, which it's there a little bit, but like that is an overbearing father on a child relationship. And it's interesting, like if it's something that I just never picked up on originally back in the day, or if it's something sort of that they're being a little more clear about. It is an interesting thing to see them even cover that aspect of it without being like, now side eye your parents, but but like it is one of those things where it's like, these are some signs that you might see in some people that could be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that they, I've seen it, the original series somewhat more recently, but I don't think I watched all of it, and I remember it being a slower build, I would say, with Junior and sort of the idea that maybe he wasn't not a bad person, a bad Gorg, but that
dogs are people, Gorgs are people. It's fine. Right. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they built to that a little bit slower in terms of understanding that maybe he wasn't all bad, and then not just that, but the reasons why he sometimes made bad choices, and that it wasn't just like, well, this character doesn't know what they're doing, they're kind of like a young child and they're very impulsive, or that it was very much that his environment was kind of pushing him in a direction, that where he didn't feel like he had a choice to do things that he didn't want to do. So I think it was handled a little bit better in the new series, although I would say that overall, like, I think the pacing is a little bit faster, which I think makes sense because a lot of things were paced slower television wise. If you try to go back and watch 1980s television for adults, sometimes you're like, oh my god, this is so long, it's so slow, it's taking so long to get to things.
They all had probably like 10 minutes more of actual showtime versus commercial time.
Exactly.
So and that is something that's interesting about the show is I think the pacing in general is good, but the episodes still feel like a little long for like the age group to me. Because like, granted, my nephew's only 1.5, but like he can't sit down and watch like a whole episode of Thomas the Tank Engine. Like he'll watch like 5 to 10 minutes and then like run around. So like it is the fact that they are, if you cut off the credits, about like 26-27 minutes, like that's pretty long
It's beefy.
for
Yeah.
they do handle the pacing in general, I think, within that time limit really well. It's just a matter of like that's a lot of stretching to do for like a kid to sit down for.
Yeah. Yeah. I do wonder if they had conversations about, target audience and what age range they were looking at, because I know that Sesame Street over the years, the reason they introduced Elmo was because they thought, oh, well, younger and younger kids are watching this. So it was
Yeah.
originally designed for school age children. And then they started addressing like preschool and then even preschool. Um, and that changes like what you cover and how pretty significantly. And I felt like maybe this version of Fraggle Rock was targeted at a very slightly older audience than the original was. That it felt more like something that a kid who was a little bit older might watch.
Right.
But yeah, that's why I would be really interested to hear more from, like anecdotally from people's kids. Like,
Yeah.
did your kid like this? Did they sit through the whole episode? Did they want to talk about it afterwards? I'd be interested to find that out. It's hard to channel that perspective, I think, as an adult.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like I have my idea of it, but like
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to my brother and I was like, when he's ready, he's gonna love this show. But like
Yeah.
there's only so much I can say for a 1.5-year-old with a vocabulary of like 20 words. It's a hard thing to pin down, but like with the fact that it captures something that like I really haven't seen the Henson, like granted I didn't have Netflix at the time of the reinvigorated Dark Crystal stuff. So I just haven't seen that much of their modern stuff. I was not very interested in that movie that they did that was like rated R. But like the what was it? The Happy Time Murders. That was it. But yeah, the stuff that they're doing in this and the feeling that it sort of evokes for me, I feel like they have not captured in a very long time. And that doesn't mean it's not what they make isn't necessarily good or whatever, what have you. But like just this feeling that it has, and that goes for like Disney Muppets stuff too. Like it's just there's a feeling that this has that is sort of inexplainable, that is just that Henson magic that like the 80s had.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it was it them catching lightning in a bottle again? Did they actually like find a proper sort of course to go that actually manages to find that again? Because I would love that to like spread across to, granted they're not in charge of it anymore, but I would love somebody at Disney to find that magic that they've now captured at Henson and find its way back over to Disney, because that is what has been missing for them for a long time. As much as I actually liked that Muppets Office show, like I thought it was all right, not spectacular, and it was a little like out of character some of the stuff they did, but like it was still fine. But it's these things where they're like chasing trends instead of like making their own way.
Yeah, and this certainly is a topic that I have a lot of very strong feelings about, and some opinions which may or may not be correct. I certainly wouldn't say like I absolutely know what they should be doing, and my answer is the only right one. But
opinions aren't wrong or right; they're just yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I'm very passionate about that. I would say, especially. I think it makes me feel more passionate that sometimes they get it. Like sometimes they really stick the landing. And the contrast between that and something that was, fun, but didn't really seem to understand the core of what it needed to be so that it worked. That contrast can be difficult, I would say, as a fan. And I wonder if maybe some of it had to do with, so mostly the modern Jim Henson Company stuff has been targeted at pretty young children. A lot of it has been digital puppetry. Like they do this thing where they have these rigs, right, where they're doing CGI, but they're actually being physically puppeted in real life. which
Yeah.
is a cool technique, but I don't know that it has quite the same energy in reality. It looks a little bit more like other kinds of preschool content that you would see. I haven't been super engaged by any of it, which is understandable. It is for preschoolers. But I think maybe not being. I think that the Muppets suffer from being under the weight of their own legacy.
Hmm.
And I think that it is very difficult for people to be creative under those circumstances. And especially now being under Disney, that you're under the weight of the legacy and you're also under the weight of the IP. And
Yeah.
that's a huge burden, like creatively, to try to find out like what works. And a lot of what has always worked with the Muppets has been being weird, you know?
Hmm.
Like I think that Fraggle Rock was a bit of a weird project at the time. And I think that being able to go off and do that and have it be characters that were loved but not as iconic and didn't have the same history with people, being able to go back into that universe and do it under the guidance of just the Jim Henson Company and not this big IP machine, I think that that probably helped a lot. But it also has a lot to do with finding the right people. Um, and I think, you know, I don't know, I have met Karen Prell, who was the original puppeteer for Red as well.
Hmm.
And she has what I would describe as huge Fraggle energy. Like she's just like that.
Yeah.
Um, I saw her and Catherine Mullen, who originally performed Moki at Dragon Con some years ago. And they were both just, I mean, exactly what you would expect if you had met them somehow in real life, like the actual Fraggles.
Yeah.
Um, it was a wild experience, and you know, I think that she was very aware of the fandom and you know, people who now have children, and but in a positive way, if that makes sense. Like I think she didn't see that responsibility as something that was difficult, but something that was like a gift. And I
Right.
think that if you can maintain that enthusiasm, if that kind of I want to do this because it's exciting, if that spark doesn't get dimmed by time or by a corporation or by the you know that being in the moment and it being difficult and thinking, oh man, this is costing so much money because I can't get this shot right.
Money
Um,
pressure is like one of the big
yeah,
ones. Yeah.
yeah, I think if you can get past that, to people who are just passionate about being creative and passionate about working with those characters, that's when the magic happens. You know, you
Yeah.
have to somehow like get free of those restrictions, which is a challenge for sure. And
Yeah.
I
It's
something
especially on the Muppet side. Like,
yes,
that's
yes,
where it gets tenfold. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think having her and Dave Goles involved, who I've also met and also had really good energy, just seemed like somebody who was just interested in people and interested in people being excited about what he has done and what he's still doing. I think that maybe they were able to find new people who understood the way the old things worked,
Yeah.
um, and to do it in an environment where they weren't just kind of being just crushed, you know, like
Yeah.
crushed under the giant wheels of an IP.
And that, yeah, the fact that they do have almost as many as they could get of the original cast that's, you
Mm,
know, remaining at this point, that definitely helps it a lot, because I like from them, I tried not to actually pay attention to that backside of things so that I could like,
yeah.
once I watched it, I could just watch it without having to like, well, that's not the voice that, you know,
Yeah.
because there are other characters that are much bigger characters that don't sound like themselves even a little bit right
Hmm.
now. So but yeah, like Goals having such a prominent at like not just one role but like multiple voices in the show is what like, and Red as well, but like it is the thing that sort of pinned it for me, where it
Hmm.
like, okay, this is where my like entry point is, and everything else is this is surrounding his voices. So because like of anybody outside of, you know, the bigger Henson names of like Jim himself and Frank Oz,
Hmm.
all of them, like Goals is the one for me that
Yeah.
like when I was a little kid, I would say like Kermit was my favorite Henson character at that point because it's just like it's an easy character. Um, but as time goes on and I started to grow up a little bit, I more and more connected with Gonzo
Yeah.
because he's weird and he gets sad and like sure like Kermit will get like bummed out once in a while, but like Gonzo has gone through like tremendously sad experiences through the years. So
Yeah. He
like
has.
there's a connection to like any voice for me that Goals does because you can hear him come through a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just like with Frank Oz, you hear Frank's voice come through in every voice at least a little bit. And so for me, everything that like is sort of that magic in that show, I can boil down to like, okay, they got this right, so
Yeah.
I'm sure that like the spiraling out will actually work. Because
Yeah.
it having some sort of like linchpin to just be like, okay, there's a safety net now. It just it was a lot more welcoming than having to be like, all right, there's only two or three of them. What does this mean? What is this gonna be?
Yeah.
But yeah, and it like on top of that, they have like obviously a bunch of the older Henson crew has passed away with time.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the more recent situations with some of the
Mm-hmm.
performers that you know there's sort of bad blood. So like
Yes.
it is anytime that they are going to bring back an old thing or anytime they continue on a thing, i.e. like the Muppets, it's there's going to be that scrutiny of like, okay, but it's not real. Like so
Mm-hmm.
as much as I try to avoid that, my mind will still kind of go there where it's like, all right,
Yeah.
you got a little bit more to prove now. But yeah.
Yeah. It's that weird, like, I think there's a subconscious thing that happens, that even if you're trying not to pay attention to that, I think, um, when something's off. Like, I think
Mhm.
I found Gobo pretty distracting in the first episode because it was like, well, now he's extremely Canadian, which I'm okay with, but, he's so Canadian. Um,
I heard it in multiple characters
yeah, yeah.
on this show. Yeah.
I know. I kind of like the idea. Feel like the Fraggles are like very Canadian, and I mean, obviously, the original production was in Canada, in Toronto as
Yeah.
well. So, it feels very fitting. But yeah, I think that your brain, even when you're trying not to do that, you're like subconsciously aware of something being different. And I think especially having goals do, if anything, traveling Matt, because he was always the character that was kind of the bridge between the reality and then your suspension of disbelief.
It was the
Um,
Sesame Street segments. It was
yeah,
where you
yeah,
see people interacting with the Fraggles.
yeah. But I think it trips some circuit in your brain that's like, oh yeah, okay, now this makes sense, and now I can
Yeah.
believe that the other Fraggles are real because he's here, and so everything
It's
is fine.
tangible.
Yeah, I mean, I think if they changed Sprocket, to be honest, like, I mean, it's a different performer, but it's effectively the same puppet.
Yeah.
It's not the same puppet, but it's the design is the same, and I think having that bridge feel the same also in a lot of ways was very helpful, for anybody who had watched it before and was trying to watch it again and not have their brains keep jumping out of it.
Well,
I
yeah,
will
because you
say,
got
yeah,
an obvious difference in docs. Like
yes, yes.
it's your one real human connection is obviously a different person now. So it is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I really like her. I think she was a good casting choice. I hope that if they do more episodes that they kind of, I feel like there's a little bit of what I would call YouTuber energy, of that kind
Hmm.
of always needing to be upbeat and always needing to be present. And I kind of want to see her be more vulnerable in the moments where she's doubting herself.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's definitely something that they could do. But I feel like Doc originally had, it was like a sadness, like an ennui to that character. And I feel like it was important because those journeys of the Fraggle characters, and like those stories are always supposed to be in parallel, right?
Yeah.
And I felt a little bit less connected to her emotional journey, and she has way less time. So
Yeah.
I hesitate to be critical of that. But at the same time, I feel like maybe it's okay, even for kids now, to let her go a little bit lower when she's at her low points, because then I think you feel her victories more. And I feel like maybe that was like a directorial choice or a script choice, rather than a performance one. But um, that's something that I had thought about, and had
And
noticed.
I do wonder if it's also how they chose to make Doc a student in this instead of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if you have somebody who is sort of like Professor Grandpa, they're
Yeah.
gonna have a little bit of sadness because, like,
Yeah.
if he was a grandfather's age when I was like 2, he's
Mm-hmm.
lived through things. Like
Yeah,
he,
that's true.
he was around during many big wars, and like
Yeah.
and it's not like in the show, but like there is that thing where it's like you recognize the things that are in your grandparents with the original Doc because
Mm-hmm.
he's of the same generation. So I wonder if that comes from just being a student and they just want to show like chipper hope almost,
Yeah.
where it's like a little bit of grit goes a long way and you can get through adversity if you just like stick to it. And I agree that like that could almost be counterproductive to the fact that like you can show somebody, like, she doesn't have to fail, but you can show somebody
Mm-hmm.
struggling and having a hard time with something, and it would sort of hammer it home, because if that lesson's not coming through on the puppet side, then you have the real person to like convey it
Yeah.
to the folks who, have a harder time picking that up from an imaginary creature.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I imagine that there were probably some long conversations about sort of how to handle that character and how to make sure that she was still relatable. And I think that may have been the idea of making her younger. That, for one thing, I think probably a lot fewer kids now live in multi-generational homes than they did.
Mm.
So you might want somebody who was younger, who would be more like the kind of person they would see on YouTube, that they would see as that kind of figure in their lives, that might be more likely than somebody who was older. That it would feel more like an entry point that they could understand of, okay, but this is an adult. This is what it means to be friends with an adult,
Yeah.
um, who's not a family member.
It's
So
like
I
an
mean,
older
I would,
cousin almost,
yeah,
where like you
yeah,
don't ever see your older cousins really get sad because they do that at their house. So
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do wonder about some of those decisions. I mean, just, from the standpoint of wondering what the process was and why decisions were made. I mean, I think I understand why they updated Moki's design. I think, in general, like, the colors are a little bit more saturated and there's a little bit more contrast, and
It's
I
a little
think
more
that works.
vibrant
Yeah.
overall and not just
Hmm.
visually. It's sort of like it carries through to the personality a little more.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. Like, I think it totally works, especially, you're talking about the switch from a show that was on film to
Yeah.
a show that's on, HD video, and it's completely different. Like, you have to design differently for something that isn't on film. So I do have some nitpicks about some of the redesigns that were more subtle, that it didn't even occur to me initially were bothering me. Like, as a builder, it is very hard for me to not look at a puppet and be watching the performance and listening to the character and believing that they're real, and also thinking about where the seams are.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I have these like multiple layers of things going on in my head at all times. And I didn't realize at first that one of the reasons that Gobo seemed strange to me was that they trimmed his hair.
Yep. I noticed
It's
that.
much shorter. It's
Yeah.
much shorter, and they did that on all of the characters. Like, they took the marabou and cut the ends off. And I would say, if I had been in that shop, I would say, like, it looks much neater that way, but if you trim it, it makes it look unnatural. And these characters are supposed to be very
Wild.
natural.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I find that because you lose those little tips move so much more than when it's cut, just because of the nature of a feather.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a little more flow and airiness to the
yeah.
original than the movement on these is like, in terms of the puppeteering, is fantastic, but yeah, you miss
Mhm.
some of that airiness and sort of what's the word I want to go for? Like it's almost like a glow that comes from the original, just because it like it gives it that little bit of extra life, that like extra little touch.
Yeah, and it's like I that's something that I've noticed in general with just all of the Muppet characters, that the one problem with refining your building techniques is that you risk refining them so much that you refine the soul out of it. And
Yeah.
it's a real danger because, obviously techniques get better and execution gets better and materials get better. And I understand why, like early Gonzo is unsettling at this
Yeah.
point. That
The
puppet is hard to
nightmare
look at.
creature,
Like,
for
yeah,
sure.
he's a little frightening. Um, but then there's a point kind of in between where he still feels very chaotic before you don't want to sand too many of those raw edges off, because I think the characters lose too much of their life no matter
Mhm.
how good the puppeteer is, because ultimately they're objects, right? So you have to keep that little bit of chaos and that little bit of imperfection, or else people don't relate to it. This is something that, because I work as a plush artist also, that I have to think about a lot of, like, what is the threshold where you want something to be repeatable and consistent, but if it's too consistent, it loses its personality. And it's very difficult. But yeah, it bothered me a little bit. I was like, it's just a little too trimmed. It's just a little too perfect.
Yeah,
Um,
and I could see that too in some of the like the snout shapes as well, just because like the fabric isn't quite the same, so it rests a little bit
mhm.
tighter almost than the original show. So you do see that sort of not detrimental refinement, but like refinement that is noticeable.
Yeah,
Whereas, we knew they were puppets back in the day, but like the magic was in the performance, and then like the materials are on top of that. And that's the whole thing, is like Jim Henson had gone on many a show and just been like, this is a sock. Like
yeah,
I'm making a sock come to life. And so he really tried to push those things that was like, no, the performance is what is the core that brings it to life, and then like the other stuff is the flourish that just like enhances that. But like you don't need any of that. You can just make something live and breathe without having to make it real. And
yeah,
that is something that is probably one of the things that you lose, say, with like on the Muppet side with Disney, because it is Disney. They are very like blueprint on everything at
yeah,
this point. So yeah, it is something that it didn't hit me as hard as it would have hit you, just because of your behind the scenes on it is probably a little more than me. But it didn't go unnoticed, for sure.
yeah, yeah. And I imagine that most people, it was again tripping that center of your brain that just sees something as slightly off. And, it's not going to affect kids who are watching it because they're not going to know the difference, I don't think. I mean, it's possible maybe that it would affect their perception of the characters a little bit because, like we talked about, I think that it does affect the performance in some ways.
Mhm.
Like the design of the puppet is actually important to
Yeah,
personality and the way that you convey it. I also have some quibbles about digitally removing the rods. Um, I actually
fair.
think that at some point, the more that you try to make something real, the less real it becomes.
Right.
That I think everyone who watched the Muppets had this internal agreement between them and the puppeteers of like, I know this is a piece of fabric with a hand up it. I know it's not real. And because I know it's not real, when the performance lands, when the story lands, when there's a song that is really powerful and moving, it moves me more because I know that this artifice that we've all agreed to exists.
You're
And I
watching the
think,
performance of
yeah.
the puppeteer at that point, and you're not
Hmm.
just watching the thing happen.
Yeah, and I mean I think it's like watching Kermit on the Muppet Show is great, but watching Jim perform it on, a late night show where you can see
It's the
both of them,
best. It's the
suddenly
best.
Kermit, he's incredibly real. And
Yep.
it's like it's a thing that doesn't make sense to people, and I think would probably be extremely difficult to explain to an executive. So I would not want to explain to this this to
Yeah.
anyone at Disney, but somehow when you can see Jim and you know for certain that he's just talking to his hand, you believe in Kermit more instead of less.
And
So
what's great too is like he's never being a ventriloquist.
yeah,
Like he doesn't hide that he's talking while Kermit's talking.
yeah,
And that's the like unexplainable magic of maybe it is that era, but like of that company at that time where like they hit it in a way that like maybe nobody else can do since, and maybe not before that either, but like it's almost just one of those things where you say like they believed in it so much that it made us believe. And that was almost a symbiotic thing where like it fed both sides. Like the more they believed, the more I believed, the more I believed, then the more they believed. And it was that back and forth relationship that allowed the characters to live sort of lifted up by the belief on both sides, and like got to be carried that way.
yeah. And I mean, I think that that's probably like a worthwhile conversation just in film and television in general of how much can you try to perfect something before you remove the thing that makes it function.
Yeah.
And I think that that's always been a danger, but it's probably more so now just because we keep trying to bring back like childhood memories and then try to have them still work somehow in the modern world. And I think we have an inclination to fix things that aren't broken, and in fact are the things that make it work. I mean, I could see some times where I thought, okay, some of those angles, the rods would be really, really visible, or it might be difficult to do a performance so that they weren't incredibly distracting. So like, if you're raising a character's hands and face, like the rod's going to wind up at a really weird angle. You're
Right.
probably going to have to bend one or something, and it's going to be right in the shot. So I can see why the decision was made, but it was hard not to be aware of it, I think. And as another conversation, I would have liked to hear why was that decision made. But every now and then I found it distracting. In scenes where the rods would have been visible but not bothersome, it bothered me because I felt like I wanted them to be there. And I knew they were there, because you can see it in the motion because they're puppets. Like they're
Yeah.
supposed to move in a way that you could tell that there's a rod there and where it is. I noticed a few times when like Boober was raising his hands, you could see like the entry point and you could see a little bit where they couldn't really remove the whole thing.
Like he has a weird little nipple on his hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, I don't know. Was this important? Like, did this need to be done? Did it help enough in these
Like it could have been
scenes
it could have
that
been
was worth it?
sparingly done without like doing it on every shot. Whereas like I do think it some of the improvements that they did to make like action a little bit more not realistic, but a little more fluid, like the shots where you have Junior and you're going over his shoulder and you see Gobo running away and do like a little flip, and it's like obviously take the rods out of that, but like because otherwise there's just two rods floating on the side. But like when there is an unnecessary inclination to like make this as living and breathing as possible, but yeah, you're totally right where it's only living and breathing because we know somebody's behind it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was very tuned into that, having very recently done this puppet project without proper equipment, without a lot of time, without anyone who had any puppeteering experience at all. Just grabbed some friends and tried to shoot it on a weekend. And
this was the fanciful holiday thing.
Yes, yes. And it was very challenging and very stressful. And I think so we filmed on Saturday and it wasn't working, and I said, we've got to fix these things. We have to shoot again tomorrow. And we shot again on Sunday and got the shots that we needed. And I went back to I left some stuff, I think I forget where I went. I went to my friend's place. And he was like, oh, well, I was just going to like hang out and watch the Muppet Show. Do you want to watch the Muppet Show? And I kind of had this moment of like, is that what I want to do right now after I've been like holding my arm over my head all day trying to do this and knowing, like, so now I'm comparing my performance to like Frank Oz and Jim Henson at the height of their skills.
Yeah, that's the difficult, like, it could be the medicine or the poison. Yeah.
Yeah. But the thing that I noticed over time, at first I was like, oh no, they're so much better and they're doing all this right and they've solved all the problems that I kept having with,
They'd also been doing it for like
difficult.
30 years at that point.
They had.
Yeah.
But it's like, I was trying to be forgiving of myself, like, okay, you literally learned monitor puppeteering in an afternoon. So this is not gonna be up to snuff. But at the same time, the more episodes we watched, the more I noticed that there were things that didn't work. You know, that there were mistakes, that you could sometimes just see somebody's head. Like there was just a puppeteer there and they, it was a complicated shot. They were on a tight schedule. They couldn't do it again. And I realized that it had always been there and I'd never seen it.
Yeah.
Or that I had seen it, but I hadn't registered it because I had, unknowingly entered into this agreement with them as performers of like, if you mess up, if I see somebody's arm, there was one shot where you could just like full on see somebody's plaid shirt, at the bottom of the shot, but it still worked. And I was like, oh, okay, now I understand that you can fight against those imperfections and you can get to a higher level of accomplishment and do more complicated scenes, do better performances, do all of this stuff and make it more believable. But at the same time, if you head too far towards perfect, you're going to mess up. Like you're going to lose something that matters in the performance. And that hadn't really clicked with me, I don't think, completely until trying to do it and getting increasingly stressed out that I was bad at it.
Right. Yeah, I hope moving forward, because that's the thing is, like you were just saying, that it's almost like it's the guys in the green screen suits where it's like, and this goes a bit like that was obviously used on the show, but like that goes into just CG everything, every movie. Like one of the things that people say with Jurassic Park is that like it still holds up because part of it is real. And like you do lose a little bit of that. Maybe it's in performance of the actual actors that are acting against an animatronic or a puppet or something. And sometimes it's just you lose that tangible thing that's being filmed. So yeah, it is interesting to think about like how hard a production will go to hide things that are already hidden in plain sight, where it is like, yeah, we never saw the puppeteer. We never saw them, even though we could have, because they were sometimes, like you said, like in the shot. That's part of that magic that like, it is an agreement. It is a contract between us and them where it's just like, no, I'm trying to see the show you're putting on. So I am not, you're in the periphery for everything else. Like I'm not going to notice you there because it's like, if you're going to like a low production play and it's like, no, I don't really notice the people in black sweatsuits putting a table or a chair on the set. Like that's the magic. It's acknowledged magic. So yeah, I hope moving forward they do kind of, I mean, I would assume they probably won't because they'll probably stick to how they did this season if they do more seasons. But I would hope that sort of moving forward with whatever comes, they do start realizing like you don't have to erase the things that are what kind of makes it. Because it is a little like on an existential level, it's a weird, sad thing to think about, like literally erasing the person making these things come to life. So it is, yeah, it's one thing when you're trying to like just keep them out of the shot, but it is another thing to say like, no, we want the performance, but not the person. And that's maybe a little headier than I even expected to go in this conversation, but that is a realization that maybe I just came across that kind of hurts. But yeah. But in terms of because we're getting closer to an hour, so I want to start rounding it out. But in terms of just this show in general, I despite the things that we have talked about and the not you said nitpicky, but it is like critiquing in general. I do think that they came out on a above and beyond impressive result, considering all the things that were working against them for bringing something back like this. Because there is, even like I just said, Jurassic Park, like as much as I appreciate the new movies, like I think they're not maligned, but like mixed for results on it. And I think like this show going back to that well, not intended, but like they managed to, for the most part, find what they captured back then, and that's a success in my book, as far as like more than I could hope for, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think the puppets are fantastic. The performers are good. The writing is fun. Sometimes it's really genuinely very funny. Sometimes it's really genuinely very moving and thoughtful. I think the music is quite strong. I think, it was a little hard to do, like, that final episode, putting the new music up against something from the old show. Oh boy. I mean, that's got to be, tough for your ego to kind of compare those two things, because I don't know that it's fair to try to compare them. But yeah, I mean, I think the music was fun and fit really well in the show. It never felt like, oh, now we have to stop everything for a song. And they were different from each other and had a lot of energy in those performances. I think they did so much right in something where there was a whole lot that could have gone wrong or just gotten lost. Like we were talking about, like, I think, well, I don't know, it's like, why is a flung Muppet the funniest thing? That is absolutely the peak of comedy, is a flung Muppet.
Ragdoll physics that's why, like, honestly, this goes with video games. I think people love ragdoll physics in video games because they loved Muppets growing up.
Oh, definitely.
Like,
and I think people really respond to that chaos element. Like, there has to be just a little bit of chaos amongst all of that intent and planning and the massive amount of work that goes into, if you get a scene with 50 Fraggles in it, boy, I mean, you're talking about a real production that you can't see, like, just out of frame. There's so much going on. But I think I was very pleasantly surprised, I would say. Like, it wasn't that I was expecting them to fail, but I could see the things that were stacked against them. And I'm glad that it's good. I'm glad that it's fun to watch.
Awesome. Well, let's round out now and say, where can folks find you if they don't happen to know where to find you?
Probably the easiest thing and the one that I update the most is Twitter. And it kind of links to anywhere else that I'm at. My Twitter is house_of_darkly, which is DARKLY. Don't ask me about the underscores. It was a bad call on my part when I first joined Twitter many years ago. And I don't post, I post Muppet thoughts there sometimes. I post TV and movie thoughts. I post work stuff. I post photos of my own puppets and my own plush sometimes. That's people pretty much where I live.
Can purchase those plush from you.
Yes, they can.
when you have that open and ready to go. I don't know if you do at the moment now.
Yeah, my Etsy shop is still open. I'm a little low on stock at the moment, so it's mostly made to order. But yeah, I'm still making plush.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts on the show and your thoughts on the general puppetry thoughts as well. So that'll do it for this episode. We'll be back soon with another episode. On top of that, this is going up later in the week, so I will say I just put out a ton of trailer reactions from Super Bowl Sunday, as well as an episode from earlier in the week with of another friend of mine that was all about the Book of Boba Fett and how that did the opposite of what this show did. So feel free to listen to those things, watch those things, and until then, bye.